It was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. The sun bathed the countryside in gold as James stood proudly in front of the house. He had built brick by brick, beam by beam, with to deepen every thought. It wasn't just a house, it was a promise. A quiet place away from the noise, where love could grow roots, where her laughter would echo in every hallway, where they would grow old together. But Deep never stepped inside. She stood at the gate, her hands trembling, her eyes brimming with tears that refused to fall. James rushed to her, beaming like a child revealing a long-awaited surprise. "I built it for you, Deep," he said, voice thick with emotion. "This is our beginning." But instead of joy, he saw heartbreak in her eyes. She shook her head slowly. "I'm sorry, James," she whispered. "I can't accept this." His smile faded. The silence between them was heavy, sharp enough to cut through steel. "Why?" he asked, the word barely a breath. Deep looked at the house, then at the man she had once believed would be her forever. "Because it's beautiful, but it doesn't feel like home. Not anymore." The truth shattered him more than any scream could. She wasn't talking about bricks or paint colors. She was talking about trust, about the distance that had grown between them ever since she found out about his closeness with his secretary. A distance no house could fix. "I wanted to give you the world," James said, his voice cracking, "but all I ever wanted," Deep replied gently, "was you, your honesty, your time, your presence. I don't need a mansion to feel loved. James, I needed you when I cried alone. I needed you when rumors hurt me and you said nothing." James stood in the silence, tears threatening. The house stood tall behind him, but suddenly, it felt empty. And so, Deep turned away, not out of anger, but because her heart had been silent for too long. She didn't need a house, she needed a home. James stood frozen at the gate long after Deep disappeared down the winding path. Her words echoed in his mind like thunder in a hollow valley. "I needed you, not a mansion." The grand house behind him, the one he thought would bring them closer, now loomed like a cold monument to his misunderstanding. The walls he had built with so much love now felt like prison bars, holding in regrets, not warmth. For days, James stayed inside, wandering from room to room, hearing her laughter in the corners, remembering her voice as she used to talk about dreams of simple joys, growing vegetables, raising chickens, waking up to the smell of fresh bread, not chandeliers and marble floors. His secretary tried calling, he didn't answer. Investors asked about meetings, he postponed them. He spent his evenings on the porch, waiting, hoping, regretting. Then one afternoon, a gentle knock came at the gate. His heart leapt, but it wasn't Deep, it was her uncle. The old man stepped forward with calm eyes and a heavy sigh. "She's staying at her aunt's farm," he said, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "She's not angry, just disappointed." James lowered his head. "I didn't cheat," he said softly, "but I was blind." "I know," the uncle replied, "but sometimes neglect feels just like betrayal." James swallowed hard. "Do you think she'll ever forgive me?" The old man looked up at the gray sky. "Forgiveness isn't the hard part. Trust is. If you want her back, don't build another house. Build a life where she feels safe again, where she feels seen." James nodded. That night, he left the house alone. He returned to the little village where Deep grew up. He helped her neighbors mend roofs after the storm. He joined the morning markets, learning how she used to sell vegetables with a shy smile. He even tried cooking her favorite pumpkin porridge, burning it 3 times before getting it right. And he waited. Waited not for her to come back, but to be worthy if she ever chose to. It was nearly dusk when Deep returned to the village market, her steps quiet, her heart uncertain. Word had reached her that James had been around helping the farmers, mending fences, even trying to cook. At first, she thought it was guilt. Then she wondered if it was love. But she wasn't ready to see him, not yet. That evening, as she walked along the narrow dirt path near the rice fields, she heard soft music. Someone was playing a familiar tune on a bamboo flute. Her breath caught. It was a lullaby her mother used to hum when she had mentioned to James once. Long ago, she followed the sound. There, sitting under the tamarind tree, was James. No suit, no expensive watch, just a man with tired eyes and gentle hands. He didn't notice her at first, too focused on remembering the notes. When he finally looked up, their eyes met. Too Deep didn't speak, neither did James. But sometimes silence carries more than words ever can. He stood up slowly and stepped forward. "I didn't come to win you back," he said quietly. "I came because this is where I should have started with you. Not with grand plans, but with quiet presence. I forgot that love isn't proven in marble halls. It's proven in muddy fields, in burnt porridge, in listening before speaking." She looked down, then back at him. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why now?" James took a breath. "Because I finally understand. You never asked me to give you the world. You asked me to see you in mine." Too Deep's eyes shimmered with uncried tears. She took one step closer, then another, and finally, she said, "I missed you. But I missed the version of you who used to sit with me under the banana trees, not the one too busy chasing sky-high dreams." James smiled sadly. "He's still here, and he's not going anywhere this time." She reached for his hand, slowly, hesitantly, and held it. For the first time in weeks, neither of them needed to run. They had found their way back not to a house, but to each other. In the days that followed, James remained in the village. He didn't try to impress Too Deep with gifts or promises. Instead, he woke up early to help her carry vegetables to the market. He learned to fix the creaky wheels on her cart. He even sat with the village elders, listening to stories of the past over cups of bitter green tea. Too Deep watched him from a distance at first, cautious, but every day, he peeled back another layer of the man he used to be, the one who once measured love by the size of a house, not the warmth of a shared meal. One evening, as the orange sun dipped behind the hills, Too Deep invited James to her small kitchen. The aroma of ginger and lemongrass filled the air. She placed a bowl of porridge in front of him and said, "This is the kind you said reminded you of your mother." James took a bite, then looked up. "It tastes like home." There was a long pause before Too Deep spoke again. "I wasn't angry because you built me a house. I was afraid that if I moved into your world, I'd lose my own, that you'd forget who I was." James reached across the table, gently taking her hand. "Then let's build a life that's ours. Not yours, not mine. Something in between, where your roots keep us steady, and my dreams take flight but never leave you behind." Too Deep looked down at their joined hands. For once, she didn't feel small in the presence of his big visions. She felt seen, heard, equal. That night, under a sky of stars and soft lantern light, they didn't talk of houses or futures. They simply sat side by side, letting the night breeze carry away the old doubts and fears. Sometimes, home isn't a place, it's a person who chooses to stay, even after they've seen all your storms. And this time, James stayed. The days turned into weeks, and for the first time in a long while, Too Deep felt a sense of calm in her heart. James had traded in his polished shoes for muddy boots, his boardroom calls for quiet mornings beside the river where she washed herbs. He wasn't just visiting her world anymore, he was living in it. But love is often tested, not by absence, but by reality. One rainy afternoon, while James helped an old farmer reinforce the thatched roof of his home, his assistant arrived from the city, soaked and breathless. "The board is in chaos," she said urgently. "Your name is being dragged through the mud. Investors are leaving. The company needs you. James, if you don't return now, it might all collapse." James stood frozen in the rain, torn between two storms, one he left behind in the city, and one brewing quietly in his chest. That evening, Too Deep found him sitting on the old bench beneath the banyan tree, the same place they had shared. Their first kiss. "You have to go, don't you?" she asked softly, her eyes unreadable. James didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "I built everything thinking it would matter most at the top. but none of it ever meant more than sitting here with you. To Deep placed a hand on his heart. Then go. Not to run away from this, but to fight for what you've built, if you still believe in it. And when you come back, not with a house, not with an apology, just come back as yourself. James stood up, his breath shaky. Will you wait for me? To Deep smiled faintly, her voice steady. I'm not a woman who waits. I'm a woman who lives. If you come back, find me living, not waiting. As the sun rose the next morning, James boarded the early train to the city, leaving behind the scent of wet earth and the echo of footsteps that no longer feared silence. He didn't look back, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew her strength would push him forward more than her tears ever could. And so began a new chapter, one written not in comfort, but in courage. Love is not about grand gestures or expensive gifts. It is about presence, understanding, and trust. In building a house for Deep, James believed he was offering her the world. But what she truly needed was something deeper, emotional honesty, not material security. Deep's decision to walk away from the house was not a rejection of James's love, but a quiet reminder that true connection cannot be built with bricks alone. It must be built with time, shared values, and the courage to face storms together. James learned that love is not always about holding on tightly. Sometimes it is about listening more deeply, letting go of control, and trusting the one you love to walk their own path while you fight for yours. In the end, the story teaches us you cannot build a future for someone if you do not understand their present. Love is not proven by what you give, but by how well you listen and grow. And sometimes, the strongest love is the one that lets the other person live freely, not trapped inside a dream they never asked for. The heart doesn't need a mansion. It only needs a place where it feels seen, safe, and truly understood. Continued life lessons from James and a Deep story. James had poured his heart into the house. Every brick, every window, every quiet corner was a piece of his hope. But in the silence that followed Deep's rejection, he realized something profound. I built her a house, he whispered to himself, but I never asked her what home meant to her. This realization became his turning point. Love is not a one-way act of giving. It is a shared journey of discovering what the other person truly needs, not what we think they need. Here are a few more timeless lessons their story teaches us. Emotional absence cannot be replaced by physical presence. James gave to Deep everything, but sometimes wasn't there when she needed him most. Love requires presence, not just presents. Communication is love's strongest foundation. Assumptions are the silent destroyers of relationships. If James had asked, listened, and truly understood Deep's dreams, he might have built something far more precious than a house. Trust. People leave not because they stop loving, but because they stop feeling safe. Deep didn't want to hurt James. She longed for a connection where her heart could breathe, not be confined to a beautiful place that wasn't truly hers. Real love is not about proving yourself. It's about becoming someone worth staying for. James thought success would win her heart, but what she wanted was authenticity, kindness, and a place in his life that wasn't earned, but chosen. In the quiet aftermath of her departure, James began rebuilding, not a house, but himself. And that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson of all. Sometimes, the person we need to build first is ourselves.